All right. Moving right along, we have our next presentation examines the very real and increasingly urgent impacts of permitting delays within PJM market and how those delays ripple across the broader energy system. At a time when electricity demand is accelerating due to the data centers, advanced manufacturing, electrification, economic growth, the ability to build generation and infrastructure in a timely manner has become central to reliability, affordability, and competitiveness. Over the past several months, USEA has worked closely with Energy Exemplar to model and better understand the downstream impacts permitting delays can have on consumers, power markets, and infrastructure deployment. Today's presentation will provide valuable insight into those findings and the broader implications for one of the nation's most important electricity markets. Joining us are Rob Homer. Rob Homer, who will be joining us virtually. He serves as the head of solutions, government affairs, and public policy at Energy Exemplar, where he works with policymakers, utilities, and market participants on power market analysis and grid modeling solutions. His work focuses on helping stakeholders better understand the operational economic impacts of infrastructure and market decisions. Will Polen is Senior Director at the United States Energy Association, where he leads policy analysis, stakeholder engagement, and strategic initiatives focused on energy markets, infrastructure, and regulatory reform. His work frequently focuses on reliability, permitting, and market power analysis. So together, they will walk us through the key findings and insights surrounding one of our country's most important electricity markets. I think you will find this very interesting. Please welcome Rob Homer and Will Polen.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for staying with us so late into the day. And I promise I'll be relatively brief so that we make time and are on time for Chair Guthrie. Rob Homer, I see my friend there. You were with us from San Antonio. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
We hear you loud and clear. Well, as Mark mentioned, USEA partnered with its member Energy Exemplar to undertake this study. And as we've heard all day today, speed to power is the jargon of the moment, but it's not just jargon, it's an essential policy fix that we need to make. And we've heard this from our members, our board of directors as well. But what we wanted to do was to use Energy Exemplar's leading optimization planning software, Plexos, to look at and quantify the impact of the current permitting regime and the lack of permitting on reliability, affordability, competitiveness, and emissions. So what this study does, well, let's see if I can get the clicker to work. Albert, can you advance the slides for me? Yeah. So what this study did, as I said, it looked at those parameters in the PJM market. It's not an exhaustive study. It's more indicative. It gives policymakers a guidance, and it attempts to quantify these parameters. So let's look at the bottom line up front, that permitting reform is not only a development issue, but it's a central determinant of the future of our energy sector, because the decisions that we're making today, that we're making in a permitting constrained environment, will echo through decades to come and reverberate for generations. And we have a choice now to change the permitting regime that we have and make a more efficient and more cost-effective energy future. If we don't do that, we will have a less reliable, less affordable, less competitive, and paradoxically higher emissions future. And we'll take a look at this throughout this presentation. We looked at three scenarios, or what I would say are three different energy futures. An unconstrained future, which is the optimal future, and it's not realistic. It's a future where we can build whatever we want to, whatever the model, whatever the optimal fleet of generation is, and we build it with no constraints. So we'll set that up as the ideal. We want to see then how far we deviate from the ideal in two other future energy scenarios, right? One is just the Q-constrained scenario. This is the scenario where we're all familiar with the generation queue in PJM and how difficult it is to maneuver through it and how long it takes to get generation sited and approved in the generation, in the queue. So we'll look at what happens if we remove that constraint. But we'll also, or don't remove that constraint, and we'll also look at even tighter constrained future, which is where we have both the constraints of the queue, but we also have the problems of permitting. And that's the most constrained and the least efficient build-out of the future generation fleet in the PJM market. Albert, if you could take us to the next slide. There we go. Now, why does timing matter here? It's important because we're going to enter we're in a rapidly increasing demand environment, but we're going to enter into a much more rapidly increasing demand environment in the late 2020s, early 2030s. And the decisions that we make in this time period, beginning today and extending through the early 2030s, will determine our collective energy future. And as I mentioned, they will have impacts for decades to come. And when there's anything in life, when you make a decision under stress, under duress, you're probably not going to make the best decision. And I think we're going to see how that plays out in this study. Let me just say a couple words about the study. I had the distinct pleasure and honor of working with Rob Homer, who at Energy Exemplar, and his colleague Chris Nichols, who's with us today and will be available to answer questions. They were the modelers. They built the model and the assumptions and scenarios that we are working with. USEA took that data, interpreted it, and is presenting these findings. So I want to turn this over to Rob for a few minutes, so that he can explain the model, the software, the assumptions, and a little bit more about the scenarios. Then I'll come back and I'll talk about the factors that we reviewed, the reliability, affordability, emissions, and economic competitiveness parameters that we looked at. So Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Will. So I can't see the slide, so I'm going to go on guess here on which slide we're on. So I'm assuming we're going to be on slide 3, which is how the analysis was conducted.
That's right.
Great, thank you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a little bit about the assumptions that we used, the methodology in which we did this study and this analysis, and then we'll kind of glean into a little bit of the results. And then, as Will mentioned, he'll take us home and talk through really the main conclusions. So what is this study? So we have, with Energy Exemplar, we have a lot of different data sets for modeling purposes around the energy systems, both power and gas. In this particular study, we focused primarily on the PJM system for a lot of different reasons, but I suspect a lot of folks here understand the complexity and challenges that the PJM market currently is exhibiting today. So the study that we did, we consolidated down and we focused on that region, and we decided that 20 years should be sufficient for us to capture an overall understanding of the load growth of that region, as well as the impacts of that load growth on expansion planning in the generation space. And with that, we did focus primarily on generation. This model is what we would call a zonal model, and therefore it doesn't really represent the transmission constraints of the system. We did this, again, because we wanted to get an indicative understanding, and the need to understand permitting delays and cost impacts of permitting delays seemed to be more relevant the timelier we could get those results out. And when we introduce complexity of the transmission system, the model can get much more complex to kind of do the analysis. So we focus primarily on that study around the generation side of the system. As Will mentioned, our focus was around an unconstrained, a Q-constrained, and Q and permitting constrained scenarios. And we'll look at those in detail, and all of our results were primarily focused around comparing the outcomes of those various scenarios, those three scenarios. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly talk through, and you can kind of toggle through those. Yeah. So the model that we used is the software that we used is a product called Plexos, and Plexos can cover a large swath of problems associated with the energy system. So everything from a very short-term to a very long-term problem across the energy landscape. So everything from power, gas, hydrogen, heat, which represents combined heat and power, water, transportation. We have a component called universal, but we won't be talking about that. But our focus here is going to be around primarily in power and specifically around the generation and our long-term based problem around the PJM market. So next slide, please. So along with the types of problems that we can solve, the various aspects within the energy landscape that we can model within the application of Plexos is covered primarily in this slide. So everything in the upper left-hand side, which would be the gas system, to renewable assets, behind the meter generation, such as vehicle to grid, hydro systems, transportation. But again, our focus is going to be mostly in the middle section here, which is going to be our typical spinning assets, renewable assets, hydro generation, and then we discount the transmission, and we use some simplistic representations of transmission constraints between zones. Next slide. And then what we would say the model that sits on top of the software is what we used as the starting point, which is the Eastern Interconnect of the entire United States. So everything on that right-hand side of the view that you're looking at. And then we carved out specifically the PJM region. So mostly the gray area, that's a little inaccurate there in that gray section, but that represents the region that this study was focused on. And within that that Eastern Interconnect and PJM data set, as you can see here, it's publicly sourced. We have folks that maintain that, updated on a regular basis, and make sure that it has updated information. And we'll talk a little bit about some more of the assumptions, specifically the demand forecast. We're gonna zoom in on the long-term demand forecast that we used from PJM that represents the high load growth area section of the model, and we're gonna get to that here in just a minute. So next slide. So that kind of entails the basic building blocks of the analysis that we did. Now, what's inside that PJM data set represents all of these assets that we list here. So our fossil units, our renewable units, and our hydro units. And then on top of that, we also have included the opportunity for it to expand out some generic asset types that we let it build out. And those are the likeliest candidates to kind of get built. So we don't expect that we're going to build any new coal assets or nuclear assets within PJM over the next 20 years. I mean, it's possible, but the reality is that that's not in consideration at this moment. But there is the expectation that we'll likely be building, single cycle, combined cycle gas units, solar, wind, potentially offshore, and then batteries as well. And so those are the candidates that will be included in those asset types. But the base model as a starting point includes these specific assets. These are all real generators that exist at real locations that have real operating characteristics. And so that's the starting point of the model as it exists today. All right, next slide. And with that, I mentioned the types of assets that we do give the model the opportunity to build beyond the existing candidates is we give it some generic representation of biomass, combined cycle, single cycle, on and offshore wind, solar, and batteries. And so we don't know what's going to get built or when it's going to get built, but we let the model just kind of say, here's what we think we're going to actually expand to. And that is really the unconstrained scenario. When we introduce the Q-constrained scenario, we actually layer on top the actual known projects as of the start of this analysis. So that's the 1,440 some odd projects that existed in the interconnection queue as the time of when we began this project. And we said, that's all we're going to let it build. We're not going to let it build anything else inside the time period that the queue is actually out to, which is approximately 2031, 2032 timeframe. And then beyond that, we let the model kind of expand out similar to what the unconstrained model does. Now, the queue and permitting constraint scenario introduces both the queue and permitting delays that you might see. So these are going to be delays that we have taken some historical data, and we've determined generally a combined cycle unit that takes this amount of time that's projected to complete at this date usually completes 2 months later or 3 months later. And so we've introduced a scenario that kind of captures that approach so we can see what the permitting delay is going to actually do. So it really, you can think of it as not just sliding projects out, but also reducing the amount that we can actually build in a given year than we thought we could build or could hope we could build without an unconstrained or permitted constrained scenario. So that kind of, in that situation, introduces the general problem and how we've gone about solving that problem. So next slide. And here's the demand forecast that I mentioned. So this is really very important in our overall analysis. We took PJM's, they would say is their base case assumption on their 20-year out demand forecast. And generally speaking, over the last, and I'm sure most folks in this room have probably heard about how demand has generally been flat over the last 10 to 15 years. And then we're starting to see this steep increase, mostly due to AI data centers, but there's other reasons behind why demand growth is expected. But you can see that demand growth happening out into the 2031, 2032 timeframe, maybe out to 2035, and then it starts to return back to a shape that's more consistent with historical demand growth scenarios that we've seen in the past. Now, this isn't our set of assumptions in this model. We tried our best in all of these scenarios to include data that we could back up with real information, like the interconnection queue, like the demand forecast that's here, like the operating characteristics of all the units that are in PJM. All of these assumptions are based on real actual data, and the permitting, even the permitting delays, is based on some historical data in which we approximate the timeliness of projects based on permitting impacts or permitting delay impacts to the overall construction of those projects. So with that, I think, Will, I think I'll cover a little bit more of the next slide and then let you pick up there. So next slide, please. Yep, so let's start talking a little bit about the results. Will's going to let me have a few moments to talk about some of the results. Otherwise, I wouldn't get to talk about all the fun stuff that's really interesting part. So the key takeaway, I know there's a lot of information. Probably folks in the back might not be able to read all of this particular slide, but let me just kind of break it down to you. So the far left pie chart represents the unconstrained, and the far right represents the most constrained, which is our queue and permitting constraints. The really big difference between the unconstrained model and both the queue and permitting constrained models from a resource construction perspective, right? So what we're looking at here is the resource mix of assets that get built based on these three different scenarios. That far left one says, I'm going to build 28% combined cycle, I'm going to build 10% single cycle, I'm going to be 54% of it's going to be, of my new build is going to be solar, and 8% is going to be my wind. Now, if we look at the other two, the big difference is going to be the shift from my combined cycle generation to my single cycle. The other aspects of my build, I see a little bit of offshore that I didn't otherwise, but that's going to be really interesting to see. And that's going to make a big difference in some of the other analysis or results that we're going to look at. So with that, Will, I'm going to hand it back to you and hopefully take us home with some really amazing results here.
Thanks, Rob. And hey, that's a great job you did flying blind.
Well, I got the slides there back at the end. So I appreciate the tech team getting them.
So look, I think you've teed it up really well. It doesn't appear to be significantly different, right? But in reality, when you look at this, the unconstrained, it features a lot more combined cycle. The fully constrained features a lot more simple cycle. So we're losing efficiency there. We get a little bit more offshore. We get offshore wind that we didn't have, and roughly the wind and the solar are the same. And I think from a USEA perspective, where we're an all energy is good, and we heard today we need every kilowatt hour we can get on the grid. This is a good story. This is a good story because we're maximizing what we can get, but we're sacrificing efficiency in the most constrained scenario, and there's a nuanced piece of the puzzle here, which it's hard to display, so let me explain it. It's a timing issue, right? The issue is that if you recall on the last slide, there's a very steep slope of demand increasing toward the end of this decade and into the middle of the next decade. And at the same time, if permitting isn't addressed, then the model, given all the characteristics of the operating plants that it contains, it calls for what it thinks can be built most efficiently and most quickly. And in this case, it's front-loading the renewables early in the process. Now, we love that. We love to see renewables being built just as much as we want to see gas units being built. But it's a question of timing, because in the rapidly increasing demand environment, we need more of the firm capacity early on in this environment, and we don't get it. And that has a lasting impact for our energy economy going forward, because the market is making decisions in a rushed way, in a constrained way, and it's bringing on whatever it can bring on, whether it's the most efficient or most efficient in the longer term. So let's take a look at what happens. Albert? So here we can see what happens when we delay with permitting. So this is a bar chart that shows you the levels of firm capacity that will be built in the scenario. So the blue bar is the unconstrained scenario. The orange bar is the Q-constrained scenario, and the green bar is the fully constrained Q and permitting scenario. So what happens is, as the demand starts to spike, in the unconstrained model, it's building out more firm capacity early on. And it builds quite a bit more, and it continues to build it out throughout the 20-year cycle of the study. The other two are more constrained and never catch up fully to what would be built out in the unconstrained scenario. So if we think of the unconstrained as ideal, you can see there's a significant departure from what the ideal would be, which we'll never get to. But in the constrained scenarios, we're losing a lot of the firm capacity that needs to be built out in that really crucial 5 to 10 years, beginning at the end of this decade and into the mid-2030s. So if we go to the next slide, what happens? Beginning in around 2036, we start to see there could potentially be unserved energy in the PJM market, and it spikes up over the course of that year. Now, it comes back down because we created the model so that we relaxed the constraints toward the end of this analytical period, and so stuff starts to get built. Because if we didn't relax the constraints, it would be absurd. It would be an absurd amount of unserved energy. But you can imagine if there is no permitting reform, then you would see a lot more unserved energy. We estimated, I think, in the peak hour of that unserved time frame is $100 billion of unserved energy. So we go to the next slide. 100 million, I'm sorry, I said billion, 100 million. And that has a material impact on the overall system cost, the cost to run the PJM market. So the blue line again, unconstrained, the orange line, the Q constrained, and the green line fully constrained. Now here, what we're taking into account in system costs, and Rob, you can help me out if I say something that doesn't make sense, but it's the cost of energy, it's the cost of the ancillary services, it's the cost of demand side, demand response, and the cost of unserved. So we get $100 billion of additional cost as a result of the fully constrained build out, and we get quite a bit more cost even if we don't resolve the queue. This has a material impact on the economic competitiveness of the PJM market, because we're saddling the consumers and the industry in the region with this higher overall system cost. Go to the next slide. We get, you can imagine that we get an affordability impact as well. We get affordability in the fully constrained scenario of almost 3 times what we would get in the ideal. And then, you can see the difference between the Q constrained and the fully constrained scenario. Going to the next slide, The paradox of this is that in it, we get a higher level of carbon dioxide emissions in the fully constrained scenario. It's a little bit, as I said, it's a little bit paradoxical. We're building out the carbon-free generation first. And so why in the early years do we see more emissions? Well, it's because when we build out the carbon-free emissions first, it can't meet the demand. And so what we end up getting is the single cycle. We get older generation units that are running longer than we expected. And when we get close to those reliability gaps in 2036, we're getting reciprocating engines, we're getting oil-fired units, we're getting anything we can throw at the problem to meet the demand. And so we end up with a higher carbon emissions profile than we would if we had gone with the unconstrained, where we were building out the firmer capacity. And those emissions don't disappear; they're there, and it's a similar story to the capital investment that we talked about earlier. You know, in this scenario, we're making decisions about investing in generation now in a constrained environment that are not optimal. Those decisions are not optimal; they're being rushed, and so we get an investment inefficiency and we get higher emissions. And so, the good news is if we go to the last slide, and this isn't a good news slide, but I'll give you the good news. The good news is if we start now and we change the permitting regime to be able to bring this capacity online sooner, we can be closer to the unconstrained ideal scenario. We'll never get there, right? It's not realistic, but we'll be further to the left in terms of those scenarios than we will be if we continue down this path today and find ourselves 5 years from now having to make the wrong investment choices, which are lumpy, long-lasting, and expensive, both for reliability, affordability, economic competitiveness, and from an emissions perspective. This report is now available on our USEA website. You can scan this QR code and get access to it. What we intend to do with it, and we've sort of talked to some of our members about this, they were really pleased to see it across the board, whether it be whether they were on the cleaner side or on the traditional side of the energy. They said these are, many times they said these are our talking points. We want to be able to, now we have a quantifiable evidence-based analysis. This is just a beginning. It's indicative, as Rob said. We haven't modeled in the transmission. We only took one region of the country. We can do this. We can expand this to the rest of the country. We can include transmission. And we will be looking for you as our members to give us some guidance as to where we take this next. But our next set of actions is to meet with policymakers and regulators and show them that there is an opportunity to have a better energy future. So, Rob, I'll ask you if you want to say any closing remarks, and maybe I guess we'll have a few minutes for questions. Okay, all right. So we won't have time for questions. But Rob, if you want to wrap it up for us from San Antonio.
Thank you very much for letting me join virtually today. I think we learned a lot. I think the emissions, as Will had said, was probably the most surprising. I think a lot of the analysis and results that we got out of the models was probably in line with expectations along a lot of folks that we have actually presented this to. But the emissions, I think, is the one that folks really kind of take a step back and say, well, that's surprising. We figured if we built less, then emissions would be better. But the reality is that we have so many assets that we have to build, and the reliability is the critical component. We will do what we need to do to keep the lights on, and that means burn whatever we can to keep those lights on, and that's not going to generate a future that's as clean as we'd like to see. So I think that was the really interesting components that came out of it that were probably somewhat counterintuitive as expected. But thank you so much, Will. Thank you, Mark, for letting me come and present with you guys today at your event. So thanks, Will.
Hey, Rob, it looks like we maybe have time for one question while we wait for Chair Guthrie to join us. Is there anyone in the room want to ask a question? Oh, let's see if somebody there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. My name is Heidi Scarth. I'm with EPRI, and I live in our energy systems modeling area. I've worked with Plexos a little, so we're kind of speaking my language now. I had a question about the generation pie charts that you showed earlier, because you mentioned batteries, but they weren't in there. So I'm curious about how your constraints affected battery permitting and battery development.
Yeah, it's probably a reporting issue. I think now that you bring that up, I suspect that we just didn't capture that, given the batteries kind of sit in another space on the expansion plan view. So that's probably just an oversight on the reporting side of things. I don't think that they were missed from a build perspective. That's a good catch.
Do you have a sense, just sort of off the cuff, about the impact, or was it relatively similar, that there was less battery development?
I wouldn't expect there to be less battery. I would imagine that it would be the same or nearly the same. And the reason why I say that is because the battery development is going to line up pretty closely to solar, obviously with your solar build outs. And those did not get heavily constrained across the system. And most of the build out constraints that we saw were, well, with some solar constraints. So you could see a little bit, probably, I would say it was probably 10 to 15% reduction in battery build out. And now that I think about it a little bit. So yeah, I would think that there's probably a reason why. I can certainly get that answer back to you if you'd like.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think that sort of takes us to the time. I think Chair Guthrie is with us. With that, I'll ask Mark to come back to the podium and introduce Chair Guthrie. Rob, thank you. Thanks again for taking the time out of your own conference to join us here today.